So here's what just happened, and I need you to understand the gravity of this moment, because what we're witnessing right now is nothing short of a complete reshaping of North American trade dynamics. Canada just doubled down on its China deal, and I'm not talking about some minor trade adjustment or a symbolic gesture. I'm talking about Prime Minister Mark Carney's government looking directly at Donald Trump's threats, at his bluster about 100% tariffs and saying, "We're doing this anyway." Let me walk you through exactly what went down because the details here matter. They matter enormously. In January, Mark Carney went to Beijing, not Washington, Beijing. And while he was there, Canada and China finalized a comprehensive trade agreement that fundamentally alters the economic landscape of this continent. China agreed to reduce tariffs on Canadian agricultural products. We're talking canola, lobsters, peas, real products from real Canadian farmers and fishermen who have been getting squeezed for years. But here's the part that has Washington absolutely losing its mind. Canada dropped its tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6%, and they're allowing up to 49,000 Chinese-made EVs into Canada annually. Now, Trump had warned Canada. He'd stood up in January and threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if this deal went through. 100%. He literally said Canada would become a drop-off port for Chinese products aimed at the American market. The usual fear-mongering, the usual bullying tactics that have defined U.S.-Canada relations for far too long. And you know what happened? Carney did it anyway. Let me explain why this is so much bigger than just trade numbers on a spreadsheet. For decades, Canada has been economically tethered to the United States in a way that's been, let's be honest, suffocating. Roughly 75% of Canadian exports have traditionally gone south of the border. That kind of dependence gives the United States enormous leverage. And successive American administrations have used that leverage, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly. Trump's tariff threats weren't new. They were just louder, crudder versions of pressure that's always been there. But what Carney is doing, what this China deal represents, is Canada finally saying enough is enough. The goal his administration has set is to dramatically increase non-U.S. exports by 2035. They're not talking about minor adjustments. They're talking about fundamentally diversifying Canada's economic partnerships so that no single country, especially not the United States, can hold Canada's economy hostage. And the timing of this couldn't be more perfect. Because right now, as we speak, American pressure tactics are backfiring in spectacular fashion. Trump thought his 100% tariff threat would make Canada back down. Instead, it accelerated Canada's pivot to China. It proved to Canadians exactly why they need to diversify. It made the case for Carney's strategy better than any political speech ever could. Let's talk about who benefits from this deal right now, today. Because this isn't some abstract future scenario. Real Canadian industries are already seeing real results. The beef industry, China reopened its market to Canadian beef after a ban that's been in place since 2021. Do you understand what that means for Canadian ranchers, for processors? We're talking about access to one of the world's largest markets for beef, jobs, revenue, economic stability for communities that have been struggling. Canadian farmers growing canola, raising lobsters, producing peas. They now have reduced tariffs getting into the Chinese market. These aren't symbolic gestures. These are concrete economic benefits that translate directly into better livelihoods for Canadian agricultural workers. And then there's the electric vehicle piece. By allowing Chinese EVs into Canada at dramatically reduced tariffs, Canada is positioning itself to be at the forefront of the electric vehicle transition. These are affordable vehicles that Canadians actually want and need. The American auto industry has been slow to adapt, expensive, and frankly out of touch with what consumers want. Chinese manufacturers have been eating everyone's lunch on EVs, and Canada just decided to actually give its citizens access to quality, affordable electric vehicles instead of protecting a failing American auto industry. Now, let's talk about what's happening in Washington, because the reaction there tells you everything you need to know about how badly this has backfired on American interests. Trump and his allies are absolutely panicking. They're scrambling because what they're realizing probably too late is that their bullying tactics don't work anymore. Canada called their bluff. Think about it from the American perspective for a second. They've relied on economic dominance over Canada for so long that they forgot Canada has options. They forgot that Canada is a G7 nation. With enormous natural resources, a highly educated workforce, and the ability to forge partnerships with other major economies. When Trump threatened that 100% tariff, he thought he was wielding a big stick. What he actually did was demonstrate to every Canadian why they need to reduce dependence on the United States. He made Carney's case for him. He handed the Prime Minister the perfect political justification for pivoting to China. And now American businesses are the ones facing consequences because if the U.S. actually follows through on those tariff threats, American consumers lose access to Canadian lumber, Canadian energy, Canadian agricultural products, Canadian automotive parts. Supply chains that have been integrated for decades would be disrupted. Costs would skyrocket. And for what? To punish Canada for daring to have an independent trade policy. Let's be clear about something else that's happening here. China is winning this exchange big time. Beijing didn't have to threaten anyone, they didn't have to bully Canada. They just had to offer a fair deal, one that recognized Canada as an equal partner rather than as a subordinate. And in doing so, they've driven a wedge between the United States and one of its closest historical allies. When China said this trade deal does not target any third parties, they were being diplomatic. But everyone knows what's really happening. China gets increased access to the Canadian market, gets a foothold in North America for its electric vehicles, and gets to demonstrate to other countries that there's an alternative to American economic domination. This is strategic genius on Beijing's part. They didn't have to fire a shot. They just had to be reasonable while the United States was being unreasonable. They had to offer partnership while America offered threats. And now other countries are watching. They're watching Canada successfully diversify away from the United States. They're watching American pressure tactics fail. They're watching China position itself as a reliable, reasonable trade partner. The implications of this extend far beyond Canada and far beyond trade in electric vehicles and canola. There's something even deeper going on here that I think gets lost in all the trade statistics and tariff percentages. This is about sovereignty. This is about Canada asserting its right to make its own economic decisions without permission from Washington. For too long, there's been this assumption that Canada needs to clear its major policy decisions with the United States, that Canadian governments need to consider American interests first, Canadian interests second. That's not partnership. That's subordination. What Carney is doing is saying that Canada is a sovereign nation that will make decisions based on Canadian interests. Full stop. If that aligns with American interests, great. If it doesn't, well, that's called being an independent country. And you can see how threatening this is to the American establishment. Because if Canada can successfully assert economic independence, what's stopping Mexico? What's stopping other countries in Latin America, in Europe, in Asia? The entire framework of American economic dominance depends on other countries believing they don't have alternatives. Canada is proving they do have alternatives, and that's terrifying to Washington. Let me zoom in on the electric vehicle component for a minute, because this is where you really see the forward-thinking nature of what Canada's doing versus the backwards-looking panic of the American response. The future of transportation is electric. That's not a political statement. That's just reality. And Chinese manufacturers are currently leading the world in producing affordable quality electric vehicles. Companies like BYD are making cars that consumers actually want at prices they can actually afford. The American approach has been to throw up tariff walls to protect legacy auto manufacturers that have been slow to innovate, expensive to buy from, and frankly producing vehicles that can't compete on the global market. That protectionism might save some jobs in Detroit in the short term, but in the long term, it just means American consumers pay more for inferior products while the rest of the world moves on. Canada's approach is different. By dropping tariffs on Chinese EVs, they're saying, "We want our citizens to have access to the best vehicles at the best prices. We want to accelerate our transition to electric transportation. We're not going to sacrifice our environmental goals and our consumers' interests to protect an American auto industry that refuses to innovate." And here's the thing, this is going to work. Canadian consumers are going to have access to affordable electric vehicles. Canada's going to meet its emissions targets faster, and the Canadian automotive market is going to be more competitive, which will force all manufacturers, including American ones, to actually improve their products if they want to compete. Meanwhile, American consumers are going to keep paying inflated prices for vehicles that can't compete globally. That's not Canada's problem. That's America's problem. And it's a problem of America's own making. The agriculture component of this deal deserves more attention than it's getting, because this is where you see the immediate, tangible benefits for everyday Canadians. Canadian beef producers just got access back to the Chinese market after years of being locked out. That's not a small thing. China is a massive market for beef, and Canadian ranchers produced some of the best beef in the world. Being shut out of that market since 2021 has hurt. It's hurt family farms. It's hurt processing facilities. It's hurt entire communities that depend on the cattle industry. Now that market's open again. And it's open because Canada negotiated a deal that serves Canadian interests. Same thing with canola farmers, lobster fishermen, producers. These are real Canadians making real living who now have better access to a massive market. The reduced tariffs mean their products are more competitive in China. That means more sales. That means more jobs. That means more economic stability for agricultural communities that have been struggling. And you know what the American response to this has been? Threats, just threats. No alternative markets offered. No deals to help Canadian farmers access other regions. Just threats to make things worse with tariffs that would hurt Canadian agriculture even more. So when given the choice between American threats and Chinese opportunity, Canadian farmers are going to choose opportunity every single, and they'd be foolish not to. Let's project forward a bit, because the implications of this deal extend far beyond 2026. Prime Minister Carney's administration has set a goal of dramatically increasing non-U.S. exports by 2035. That's less than a decade away. This China deal is the first major step in that strategy, but it won't be the last. Canada is going to be pursuing trade agreements with India, with the European Union, with Southeast Asian nations, with Latin American countries. The strategy is clear. Build a diversified portfolio of trade relationships so that no single country can exert the kind of pressure the United States has historically wielded. And as Canada succeeds in this diversification, the power dynamic between Canada and the United States fundamentally changes. Suddenly, American threats carry less weight. Suddenly, Canada has leverage of its own. Suddenly, the relationship has to be more equal because Canada has other options. This is going to reshape North American politics. It's going to force American policymakers to actually treat Canada as a partner rather than as a subordinate, because if they don't, they're going to find themselves increasingly isolated as Canada builds stronger relationships elsewhere. We have to talk about Donald Trump's role in all of this because his 100% tariff threat was the catalyst that made this all possible politically for Carney. Trump thought he was being strong. He thought he was protecting American interests. What he actually did was push Canada away. He made the case for Canadian diversification better than any Canadian politician ever could. Every time Trump threatens Canada, every time he insults Canadian leaders, every time he treats Canada as a subordinate rather than as an ally, he makes it easier for Carney to sell Canadians on the need for this trade diversification. He turns what could be a controversial policy into common sense. And the tragedy for American interests is that Trump and politicians like him don't seem to understand this. They think that because the United States is larger and more powerful, they can just bully neighboring countries into compliance. They don't understand that in the modern global economy, countries have options. They don't understand that threats often backfire. This China deal is Donald Trump's creation as much as it is Mark Carney's. Trump made it necessary. Trump made it politically viable. Trump made it urgent. And now Trump and American businesses are going to live with the consequences of that miscalculation. There's a broader lesson here about economic coercion and why it's failing in the 21st century. For decades, the United States has used economic pressure as a primary foreign policy tool. Sanctions, tariffs, threats of market access denial. And for a while, it worked because the United States was so economically dominant that countries often didn't have realistic alternatives. But the global economy has changed. China has risen as an alternative pole of economic power. Regional trade blocs have formed. Countries have diversified their partnerships. And increasingly, American economic threats don't carry the weight they once did. Canada's successful pivot to China in defiance of American threats is a case study in this new reality. It demonstrates that middle-power countries can successfully resist American economic coercion if they're willing to develop alternatives. And other countries are watching. They're learning from Canada's example. They're seeing that American threats can be weathered, that alternatives exist, that economic sovereignty is achievable even for countries that have historically been in America's orbit. This has profound implications for American foreign policy going forward. The toolkit that worked for the last several decades is becoming less effective, and American policymakers are going to have to adapt or find themselves increasingly unable to shape global economic arrangements the way they've become accustomed to. Let me bring this back to why this matters so much to everyday Canadians. Because sometimes in all the talk about trade policy and international relations, we lose sight of the human element. Canadians are tired of being treated as inferior neighbors. They're tired of American politicians casually threatening their economy. They're tired of being expected to subordinate Canadian interests to American preferences. This China deal and the broader trade diversification strategy it represents is about respect. It's about Canada demanding to be treated as an equal. It's about Canadian leaders finally standing up and saying, "We're going to make decisions based on what's best for Canadians, not based on what keeps Washington happy." And that resonates. It resonates with Canadian farmers who want access to global markets. It resonates with Canadian workers who want their country to have economic sovereignty. It resonates with Canadian consumers who want access to affordable products, including electric vehicles. It resonates with Canadian citizens who are proud of their country and tired of watching it be pushed around. Mark Carney understands this. He understands that standing up to American pressure isn't just good policy. It's good politics. Canadians want a prime minister who will defend Canadian interests, even when that means defying the United States. And that's exactly what he's doing. There's an environmental aspect to this that deserves attention because it's connected to the electric vehicle component of the deal. Canada has ambitious climate goals. Meeting those goals requires rapidly transitioning to electric vehicles. But if electric vehicles remain prohibitively expensive for most Canadians, that transition isn't going to happen fast enough. By allowing Chinese EVs into Canada at reduced tariffs, the Carney government is accelerating that transition. They're making electric vehicles accessible to ordinary Canadian families, not just wealthy early adopters. That's going to reduce emissions. That's going to help Canada meet its Paris Agreement commitments. That's going to position Canada as a climate leader. Meanwhile, the United States, with its protectionist tariffs, keeping Chinese EV prices artificially high, is slowing its own transition to electric vehicles. American consumers face higher prices, so adoption rates remain lower, so emissions targets are harder to meet. This is another area where American policy is counterproductive even to American interests. If the goal is to address climate change, then you want to accelerate EV adoption, which means making them affordable. Protectionist tariffs that keep prices high work against that goal. Canada's choosing the pragmatic path, the path that actually serves its climate goals rather than the path that protects legacy industries at the expense of the environment. So, where does this go from here? Because we're watching this situation unfold in real time, and the next moves matter enormously. The ball is in America's court. Does Trump actually follow through on his 100% tariff threat? If he does, he's going to trigger a trade war that hurts American businesses and consumers far more than it hurts Canada. Canadian exports to the U.S. would face massive tariffs, yes, but American imports from Canada would disappear, causing supply chain chaos, price increases, and shortages. More likely, there's going to be a lot of bluster from Washington, but a recognition that actually implementing those tariffs would be economic suicide. So we'll probably see threats, angry statements, maybe some targeted retaliatory measures, but not the full 100% tariff wall that's been threatened. For Canada, the strategy is clear. Continue diversifying trade relationships. Continue building partnerships with China, with Europe, with Asia, with Latin America. Continue reducing dependence on the American market so that American threats become less and less relevant over time. The next few months are going to be fascinating to watch because we're seeing a fundamental shift in North American economic relations playing out in real time. And Canada, not the United States, is in the driver's seat. There's a credibility issue here that's worth examining. When the United States makes threats and then either doesn't follow through or follows through in ways that hurt itself more than its target, it loses credibility. Trump threatened 100% tariff if Canada did this China deal. Canada did the deal. Now what if Trump doesn't follow through? The threat is revealed as empty and future threats carry even less weight. If he does follow through, he triggers economic pain in the United States that makes the threat look foolish. Either way, American credibility takes a hit. And that matters because international relations depend heavily on credibility. If your threats aren't believed, you've lost a major tool of influence. Canada, on the other hand, is building credibility. They said they were going to diversify trade. They're doing it. They said they wouldn't be bullied by American threats. They're proving it. Other countries see this, and Canada's credibility as an independent actor on the world stage increases. This isn't just about one trade deal. This is about reputation, about how countries are perceived, about who's seen as reliable and who's seen as erratic. And right now, Canada is winning that battle. Some people are going to ask whether this damages the broader USC alliance, whether trade tensions spill over into security cooperation or other areas of the relationship. And that's a legitimate question. But here's the thing. Alliances work best between equals. When one partner treats the other as subordinate, when one partner assumes it can make demands and expect compliance, that's not a healthy alliance. That's a relationship of dominance and subordination. What Canada's doing is insisting on a more equal partnership that might create short-term friction, but long-term, it's actually healthier for the alliance because it's based on mutual respect rather than on one country's ability to coerce the other. The United States needs to learn that it can't have it both ways. It can't treat Canada as a subordinate in economic matters and then expect Canada to be a loyal ally in security matters. If America wants a strong alliance with Canada, it needs to treat Canada as an equal partner across all domains. This trade deal is Canada sending that message. Whether Washington hears it and adjusts its behavior accordingly remains to be seen. Let me bring this all together because what we're witnessing is genuinely historic. Canada just demonstrated that a middle power can successfully defy American economic pressure if it's willing to develop alternatives. Prime Minister Mark Carney looked at Donald Trump's 100% tariff threat and said, "We're doing this anyway." And then he did it. The China deal is now finalized. Canadian farmers and businesses already have improved access to Chinese markets. Canadian consumers will soon have access to affordable Chinese electric vehicles. Canada's trade diversification strategy is underway and producing concrete results. Meanwhile, American threats have been revealed as ineffective. The pressure campaign backfired. Instead of forcing Canada to cancel the China deal, the threats accelerated it, justified it, made it politically essential for Carney to prove Canada wouldn't be bullied. This is a watershed moment in North American relations. The economic dynamic that has defined this continent for decades is shifting. Canada is asserting sovereignty. America is losing its ability to dictate terms, and the rest of the world is watching and learning. For Canadians, this should be a moment of pride. Your government stood up for your interests. Your Prime Minister refused to cave to threats. Your country is charting an independent course based on Canadian priorities, not American demands. For Americans, particularly those who support the kind of aggressive, threat-based approach that Trump embodies, this should be a wake-up call. That approach isn't working anymore. It's backfiring. It's pushing allies away and strengthening competitors. A new approach based on partnership rather than domination is desperately needed. But regardless of whether Washington learns that lesson, Canada's moving forward, the China deal is done. The diversification strategy is underway, and the era of Canadian economic subordination to the United States is coming to an end. That's what just happened. That's what it means. And that's why this matters so much more than just another trade agreement. This is Canada saying enough is enough. This is Canada choosing its own path. And this is Canada winning.